Some cars are known for their beauty, their sleek lines, and their timeless designs. But for every beautiful classic, there's a horrifying misstep. A vehicle so ugly, it makes you question the very idea of automobile design. These American cars didn't just fail in style, they defied it, turning the automobile from an elegant machine into a grotesque nightmare. From awkward proportions to baffling styling choices, these cars will haunt you long after you've seen them. The automotive world will never forget these disasters, and frankly, you may not want to either. Buckle up. It's going to be an ugly ride. Here are the 10 ugliest American cars that will leave you shocked at how they ever made it past the drawing board.
Dear viewer, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for your support.
Number 10. The 1975 Plymouth Valiant Brougham. This model year saw the once practical, honest Valiant undergo a cosmetic transformation intended to elevate it into the realm of personal luxury, a term that was, by this point, being applied to everything from full-size coupes to compact sedans. Unfortunately, the result was a car that sacrificed identity and coherence in favor of superficial glitz. Let's break down exactly why the Brougham version of the 1975 Valiant became known, less than affectionately, as a cheap sofa on wheels. Before we dissect the Brougham version, it's important to appreciate what the Plymouth Valiant originally was. Introduced in 1960, the Valiant was Plymouth's compact alternative in an era when small, affordable, and efficient vehicles were gaining traction in the American market. It was known for its reliable slant-six engine, simple design, and low cost of ownership. The Valiant earned a reputation for being basic but durable, and it had a strong following among budget-conscious buyers, people who cared about transportation, not prestige. But by the mid-1970s, Chrysler, like most American automakers, was chasing a strange design trend, gilding the humble. Even the plainest sedans were being tarted up with vinyl roofs, fake wood trim, and luxury-sounding trim names like Brougham. By 1975, Plymouth introduced the Valiant Brougham, an attempt to keep the aging compact relevant by dressing it in the language of luxury. But rather than elevate the car's image, this trim level only managed to accentuate its weaknesses. The Brougham package slapped on chrome wherever it would stick, along the sides, around the windows, across the grille, and sometimes even on the wheel well trim. But unlike true luxury cars that integrated brightwork into elegant lines, the Valiant Brougham looked like it had been bedazzled in haste. The simple Valiant body, with its squared-off edges and boxy profile, wasn't suited for ornate decoration. The result was that all this chrome highlighted how bland and dated the shape had become, rather than masking it. In typical mid-70s fashion, the Valiant Brougham also received a padded vinyl roof, a flourish meant to suggest sophistication. Unfortunately, this just made the car look more like a budget retirement home on wheels than an upscale sedan. Often in dark or beige colors, the vinyl roof clashed with the body paint, making the car resemble an old couch that had been awkwardly reupholstered. It was decorative for the sake of being decorative, and it fooled no one. Inside, things didn't improve. The Valiant Brougham's seats were supposed to offer premium comfort. In practice, they were overstuffed bench seats with excessive button tufting and fabric patterns that looked like they had been stolen from a 1970s motel. Upholstered in materials that mimicked velvet or crushed velour, they may have been soft, but the comfort was marred by their lack of support, especially on longer drives. You didn't sit in the Valiant Brougham, you sank into it. The whole aesthetic was less automotive interior and more living room reject. The dashboard and door panels were dressed up with fake wood grain applique, sometimes in shades that could only be described as orange laminate. Combined with the thin plastic trim pieces and oversized horn button, the effect was cheap, not classy. While Plymouth tried to imply elegance, the design screamed low-budget theatrics. Mechanically, the Valiant Brougham was little different from the base models, and its cosmetic upgrades did nothing to improve performance or handling. Most Broughams came with the tried-and-true slant-six 225 engine, which was reliable but far from exciting. There were optional V8s, but even those were choked by emissions equipment, resulting in sluggish acceleration and wheezy passing power. The suspension was tuned for softness, which matched the couch-like interior. But soft in this case also meant vague steering, excessive body roll, and nosediving under braking. With all the Brome's added trim, weight increased slightly, not significantly, but just enough to emphasize the car's already unimpressive dynamics. It floated rather than drove. The real failure of the 1975 Plymouth Valiant Brougham wasn't mechanical. It was conceptual. Chrysler tried to impose luxury onto an economy car platform, but the result was an awkward hybrid. A car with the soul of a commuter box and the costume of a Cadillac impersonator. Consumers weren't fooled. Those who wanted luxury weren't interested in a Valiant, and those who liked the Valiant's honest simplicity found the Brougham version gaudy and unnecessary. Worse, the styling cues used here, vinyl, fake wood, chrome, were already on their way out of fashion, making the car look old-fashioned the moment it arrived. Number 9, the 1959 Buick Lasaber, a car that didn't just reflect its era's obsession with size, flash, and futurism, it amplified it into something nearly surreal. If ever there was a car that looked like a spaceship melting under a heat lamp, it was this one. Let's examine what made the '59 Lasaber such a monument to excess, how its design choices made it iconic for all the wrong reasons, and why it stands today as a cautionary example of when automotive styling leaps the guardrails of good taste, the end of the 50s and the birth of chrome mania. To understand the 1959 Buick Lasaber, you have to understand the mindset of the late 50s. America was in the post-war boom. Optimism was sky high. The jet age was in full swing. Space exploration was no longer science fiction. It was on the evening news. Automakers responded by turning cars into rolling expressions of futuristic fantasy. Tail fins, rocket shapes, and enough chrome to reflect the entire suburb. Buick, trying to reassert its identity in a crowded GM lineup, went all in on this design language with the 1959 Lasaber, which replaced the earlier Special as Buick's entry-level full-size car. Let's dissect the 1959 Lasaber from front to back and try to understand why this car looked like it had been designed with a ruler, a compass, and a box of Crayolas. The front grille stretched from fender to fender, composed of dozens of tiny square openings and polished brightwork that made it look more like an air conditioner vent than a car component. Chrome trim wrapped around nearly every visible edge. From bumper tips to headlight bezels, the Lasaber glared with so much reflected light, it was probably a safety hazard to oncoming traffic. It was ornamentation over function, prioritizing glitz over good sense. The dual headlights were set in exaggerated pods that looked like eyeballs peeking from under metallic eyelids. Above them, sculpted fender lines resembled an angry brow, giving the car a permanently menacing glare, like a Buick that had just woken up on the wrong side of the garage. No part of the Lasaber shouted 1950s louder than its horizontal tail fins. While many cars of the era went vertical, see Cadillac, Buick spread its fins wide and flat, almost like aircraft wings, or the stabilizers on a Cold War missile. These tail fins flared dramatically outward, culminating in rocket-like taillights that looked straight off a Ray Bradbury book cover. The problem wasn't just size, it was the lack of restraint. These fins weren't integrated, they were bolted-on declarations of stylistic one-upmanship. The sides of the car featured swooping, melted-looking body lines, where fender curves and quarter panels seemed to ooze toward the ground like candle wax. From certain angles, the Lasaber didn't look parked. It looked like it was sagging under its own stylistic ambition. The body was so overwrought, it gave the illusion of movement. Not the graceful glide of a road car, but the slow slouch of a creature collapsing under its own weight. The interior of the 1959 Lasaber continued the excess. Dashboard styling featured chrome trim, jet-age gauge clusters, and sculpted plastic shapes that wouldn't have looked out of place on a 1950s television console. The steering wheel had chrome horn rings, the seats were decked in flashy vinyl and fabric combinations, and the door panels often sported embossed patterns that made no ergonomic or aesthetic sense. It was as if the designers were saying, "Let's do everything, then do a little more." Mechanically, the Lasaber was nothing revolutionary despite its futuristic look. It used Buick's nailhead V8 engines, which were powerful but heavy and inefficient by modern standards. Suspension was floaty, steering was vague, and braking wasn't particularly confidence-inspiring. Buick had also begun experimenting with mirror-matic speedometers and flashy gadgets, but these often proved more distracting than useful. The technology couldn't back up the styling, so while the car looked like it came from 20059, it drove like it was stuck in 1949, a rolling monument to design excess. So what is the legacy of the 1959 Buick Lasaber? It was not subtle. It was loud, shiny, over-finned, and proudly overdone. It may have turned heads, but it didn't turn them for the right reasons. The car is often cited as a textbook case of overstyled post-war American automobiles, a symbol of how automakers sometimes let fantasy override function. The excesses of the Lasaber and its contemporaries were so egregious that by the early 1960s, a complete styling reset was underway. By 1962, most automakers had toned down fins, chrome, and bulbous forms in favor of cleaner, crisper lines. Number 8, the 1980 Chrysler LeBaron Coupe. In an era that was cautiously stepping into a new world of downsizing, fuel economy, and aerodynamic progress, Chrysler delivered, well, a 1950s throwback wrapped in vinyl. The 1980 LeBaron Coupe is a prime example of how outdated styling, misplaced nostalgia, and badge-driven luxury aspirations collided to create a car that looked lost in time before it even left the showroom. Let's explore the missteps of this peculiar coupe, both aesthetically and conceptually. By 1980, the American automotive industry was undergoing a transformation. Fuel crises in the 1970s had forced manufacturers to rethink vehicle size, weight, and efficiency. Imports from Japan and Europe were making waves with compact, purposeful, and often better-built alternatives. American brands had begun downsizing platforms, but many were still trying to market old-school luxury cues to a changing audience. Chrysler's answer? The LeBaron, now spun off as a compact personal luxury car based on the M-Body platform, itself a variation of Chrysler's aging rear-wheel drive architecture. It wasn't innovative, it wasn't efficient, and stylistically it was a muddled throwback to a bygone era, a confused design stuck in the past. Let's go piece by piece and break down the visual problems with the 1980 LeBaron Coupe. A personal coupe that forgot the personal. The LeBaron Coupe featured a thick B-pillar, breaking the clean flow of the side windows and ruining any chance of a sleek, open-air appearance. Most luxury coupes aim for pillarless hardtop styling to evoke sportiness or elegance. The LeBaron? It looked like a four-door sedan that had two doors lopped off. The pillared design clashed with the personal luxury image Chrysler was trying to sell. It felt more practical sedan than aspirational coupe. A padded vinyl roof was standard fare, complete with opera windows and decorative trim. But in 1980, this was already a fading trend. Vinyl roofs had once symbolized elegance, but by the 80s they screamed last-ditch effort to look upscale. Combined with the upright roofline and short rear deck, it made the LeBaron look like a retired banker's idea of flash. Perhaps the most confusing part of the car was its front fascia, which looked like it had been lifted straight off a mid-1950s Imperial, complete with vertical bars and a squared-off surround. In an age when competitors were experimenting with aerodynamic noses and integrated bumpers, the LeBaron had a retro face that looked bolted on, like a museum piece awkwardly glued to a modern appliance. It didn't say "Modern Chrysler," it said, "I miss Eisenhower." While some early 80s cars were embracing boxiness as part of the sharp-edged modernism trend, e.g. the Volvo 240 or the Audi 5000, the LeBaron Coupe's shape was chunky without being purposeful. The car sat high, with narrow wheels and big overhangs, which made it look top-heavy and out of proportion for a supposedly nimble coupe. There was no flow, just a series of slabs and angles that gave the car a blocky, static appearance, like it had been designed in reverse, starting with features, then gluing them to a leftover body shell. Chrysler marketed the LeBaron Coupe as a luxury alternative in the compact segment, but that illusion didn't hold up under scrutiny. The interior was plush-looking but cheap-feeling. Velour seats, plastic wood grain, and fake chrome trim made it feel more like a padded cell than a luxury lounge. Under the hood, typically a 225 cubic inch slant 6 or a 318 V8, reliable but unrefined and underpowered, especially when choked by early emissions gear. Features like opera lights and padded headrests were supposed to distract from the fact that the car had outdated engineering and bland performance. It was trying to be a poor man's Cadillac Eldorado, but ended up more like a rich man's Dodge Diplomat. The 1980 Chrysler LeBaron Coupe was not well remembered, even among Mopar enthusiasts. Sales were lukewarm, and while the LeBaron name would survive and later be applied to the K-platform FWD models, the Coupe itself faded quickly. It was too square, too old school, and too uncertain of what it wanted to be. Compared to emerging competitors like the Buick Regal, Ford Thunderbird, or even imported personal coupes, the LeBaron looked like a relic from 2 decades earlier, dragging its chrome dentures behind it. In the end, the 1980 Chrysler LeBaron Coupe is a case study in stylistic confusion and missed timing. It was a car that tried to ride the wave of personal luxury just as that wave was crashing on the shore. It clung to 1950s design cues in an era moving towards streamlined, integrated styling. And worst of all, it lacked a clear identity. Was it luxury, nostalgia, compact practicality? It never quite decided. The LeBaron Coupe didn't fail because it was broken. It failed because it was anachronistic, like watching someone show up to an 80s. Number 7, the 1991 Chevrolet Caprice Classic. A car that was supposed to carry the full-size American sedan into a bold new era, but instead became a punchline for awkward design and bloated styling. Known by critics and fans alike as the Bubble Caprice, this model year's redesign marked a sharp departure from the squared-off, stately lines of its 1980s predecessors. And the results were controversial, to say the least. While police departments and fleet buyers embraced it, the general public was far less forgiving. Let's examine what made the 1991 Caprice such a strange blend of aerodynamics, awkward proportions, and institutional loyalty, and why this big jelly bean on wheels missed the mark with consumers. By the late 1980s, General Motors had a problem. Their big, full-size sedans were starting to look like relics from a past decade. The outgoing 1990 Caprice had a clean, boxy design, popular with traditional buyers, but outdated next to more modern imports. The automotive world was moving towards smoother, more aerodynamic silhouettes, thanks to fuel economy standards and a growing interest in wind tunnel design. GM responded with a total reskin for 1991, keeping the same B-body platform, but dramatically altering the appearance. The result was the infamous Bubble Caprice, and few were prepared for just how radical the change would look. Let's dissect what made the 1991 Caprice look like something more suited for a lunchbox than a garage. The car's once sharp edges were completely erased. The new body featured a rounded roofline, bulging fenders, and a sloping rear window. While aerodynamically beneficial, it had a lower drag coefficient. The look was blobby and heavy, resembling a giant jelly bean, or worse, a capybara with headlights. The bulky rear and tall beltline made the car look portly, lacking the visual grace of competitors like the Ford Crown Victoria, which retained more traditional proportions. The design featured partially enclosed rear-wheel openings, often referred to as fender skirts. This feature gave the Caprice a lowrider look, but it also made the car seem ungainly and underwheeled, as if it were dragging its rear end through the mud. Critics quickly mocked this as an aesthetic blunder, one that made the car feel both slow and unathletic. Unlike the chrome-laden Caprices of the past, the 1991 model had smoothed-over surfaces and flush-mounted headlights, lacking visual excitement. The front grille was narrow and horizontal, giving the car a drowsy, unimpressed expression. It wasn't just boring, it was almost anonymous. People who saw it in traffic often thought, "What is that thing?" Not in a good way. The inside of the 1991 Caprice was spacious, yes, but uninspiring. The dashboard was a sea of gray plastic, and the instrument cluster looked decades behind competing Japanese sedans. Visibility was compromised by the thicker C-pillars, and the seating position was lower, giving drivers the feeling of sitting in a tub rather than commanding the road from above. While it had plenty of trunk space and comfort, the interior felt institutional, not premium, which may explain its popularity with police departments. While the styling was a miss, not all was lost mechanically. The base engine was a 305 cubic inch V8, but a 350 cubic inch version, 5.7 liters, was optional, particularly popular with law enforcement. The Caprice, especially in police package 9C1 trim, earned praise for its durability and strong power delivery. Handling was improved somewhat over the previous generation, but this was still a boat on the road. Soft suspension, lots of body roll, and vague steering. Still, reliability and low maintenance costs made it an ideal fleet car, even if private buyers were less impressed. When the 1991 Caprice debuted, critics and buyers were unimpressed. Automotive publications referred to the redesign as lumpy, portly, and uninspired. Longtime Caprice owners felt alienated, missing the upright, formal stance of earlier models. Sales to individual buyers slumped, while fleet sales skyrocketed. The Caprice quickly became the de facto police cruiser, taxicab, and government service vehicle of the early 1990s. For civilians, the message was clear: this car isn't for you anymore. Ironically, while the 1991 Caprice was mocked for its looks, its platform remained remarkably resilient. The car was produced until 1996, with minor revisions and a performance version known as the Chevrolet Impala SS, which did win over enthusiasts with its monochrome bodywork and LT1 V8 engine. The Caprice's bubble shape, however, never shook its reputation. Even today, it's remembered less as a great car and more as a styling cautionary tale. Number 6, the 1987 Dodge Aries K. Known for its boxy silhouette, bare-bones styling, and utilitarian purpose, the Aries K wasn't built to turn heads. It was built to save a company. This car helped rescue Chrysler from bankruptcy in the early 1980s, but by the time 1987 rolled around, it was long in the tooth, painfully outdated, and visually uninspiring. It wasn't so much designed as it was packaged, like a refrigerator with turn signals. So let's explore the 1987 Aries K, a car that kept costs low, functioned adequately, and looked like a rolling shoebox shouting, "Affordable mediocrity." Before we rip into the Aries' design flaws, it's important to acknowledge its origin. In the late 1970s, Chrysler was on the verge of collapse. Enter the K platform, an economical, front-wheel drive compact that could be mass-produced in various configurations. The Dodge Aries and its sibling, the Plymouth Valiant, debuted in 1981 and became known as the original K cars. By being cheap to build, fuel-efficient, and practical, they helped Chrysler secure government loans and regain profitability. However, by 1987, the Aries was well past its expiration date, still plodding along while the industry moved on. The 1987 Dodge Aries looked like it had been drawn with an Etch-a-Sketch. The Aries had a no-nonsense, rectilinear profile, flat panels, right angles, and little to no curvature. The roofline was flat as a table, the sides slab-like, and the bumpers protruded with all the elegance of a cardboard box's flaps. If there was any aerodynamic intent, it was hidden behind 90-degree corners and a vertically stacked grille. No fancy trim, no styling flourishes, just plastic wheel covers, thin moldings, and a badge that read Dodge, with all the charisma of a fax machine label. The front fascia featured square headlights and a grille that could have been borrowed from a desk fan. The Aries came in a range of colors, all of which somehow made it look more beige, even if they were blue or maroon. Even the two-tone versions, when offered, managed to look like a rental car someone forgot to return in 1983. The inside of the Aries didn't just whisper budget, it screamed fleet spec. Materials were hard plastic, rough vinyl, and fabric that looked like it was designed for bus seats. Instrumentation was sparse, speedometer, fuel gauge, and that was about it. If you were lucky, you got an AM/FM radio that crackled like a campfire. The seats were flat, unsupportive, and often covered in upholstery patterns that looked like they came from a motel curtain catalog. Cabin insulation? Just enough to drown out polite conversation. It was bare bones, pure function, and wholly uninterested in the concept of driving enjoyment. The Aries K was powered by the 2.2-liter inline-4, an engine designed for simplicity, not excitement. It delivered around 93 horsepower, and that was being optimistic. Acceleration was more of a process than an event. Merging onto highways required patience, prayer, and a downhill on-ramp. Handling was floaty, vague, and unimpressive, though the front-wheel drive layout gave it decent traction in snow, one of its few redeeming qualities. The ride comfort was passable, but the car creaked, groaned, and rattled like it was always one pothole away from retirement. Safety features were practically non-existent. By 1987, many competitors were offering anti-lock brakes or airbags. Not so with the Aries. Side impact protection was minimal, and the structure didn't inspire confidence. If hit, the car seemed more likely to fold than defend. Rust-proofing was poor, and build consistency was all over the place. Doors didn't always align, and trim pieces occasionally looked like afterthoughts. The Aries K sold reasonably well, but not because people loved it, they needed it. It was a popular choice for budget-minded families, rental fleets, and retirees who just needed something to get to the store and back. In 1987, it was already outdated, with competitors like the Honda Accord and Ford Tempo offering more style, comfort, and performance. Enthusiasts ignored it. Designers disowned it, but bean counters loved it. And that's the essence of the 1987 Dodge Aries. The car you drove when you didn't really care what car you drove. In many ways, the 1987 Dodge Aries K represents the best and worst of what utilitarian design can be. It kept Chrysler alive, and for that, it deserves credit. But as a product, it was the epitome of uninspired transportation. A box on wheels with a heartbeat, barely. Number 5, the 1970 AMC Rebel. Born in an era of growing competition and bold styling choices, the Rebel tried to split the difference between practical family transportation and muscle car aggression, but instead ended up looking like it wasn't quite sure what it was supposed to be. In fact, the best way to describe it might be, it looks surprised to be alive. Let's break down why the 1970 AMC Rebel, with its awkward front fascia, anonymous lines, and design by committee aesthetic, remains a poster child for uninspired American mid-size cars of the era. By the late 1960s, American Motors Corporation was stuck between a rock and a big three. AMC was always the underdog, fighting to survive among the giants, GM, Ford, and Chrysler. The company often had to reuse platforms, share components, and make do with thinner budgets. The Rebel was AMC's entry into the mid-size market, going up against icons like the Chevrolet Chevet, Ford Torino, and Plymouth Satellite. The 1970 Rebel marked the last year of the nameplate, a swan song that tried to punch above its weight but barely cleared the ropes. Let's start with what might be the Rebel's most distinctive, or rather, least flattering, visual feature, its front end. The 1970 Rebel had a weirdly wide-eyed look, thanks to its twin round headlights, sunken into ovoid bezels that gave it a permanent look of startled confusion. The narrow horizontal grille and the chrome divider tried to add aggression, but instead just emphasized the car's facial imbalance, as if it had just been startled by its own reflection. It was neither sleek nor intimidating. It simply looked awkward, like a deer caught in the headlights. Except it was the headlights. The body was heavy and slab-sided, with minimal sculpting or detailing. It looked bloated, particularly in rear three-quarter view. The rear fenders bulged slightly, but not in a muscular way, more like a sagging attempt at athleticism. The roofline was blocky, and the rear end had taillights that looked like leftovers from another model. The end result? A car that looked like a styling mule, not a finished product. Inside the 1970 Rebel, the story didn't get much better. The dashboard was plain and plasticky, with squared-off gauges and generic knobs. AMC's materials were known for being durable, but not exactly luxurious. Expect scratchy vinyl and lots of hard surfaces. Seat comfort was passable, But nothing about the cabin stood out. It was like a motel room on wheels. Clean, basic, and completely forgettable. AMC did offer a performance variant, the Rebel Machine, which came with a 390 V8 and red, white, and blue paint. That car was ridiculous in a charming way. But the regular Rebel, less so. Entry-level versions came with an inline-six that offered tepid performance. Optional V8s were available, but even then, the Rebel lacked the refinement or polish of GM's or Ford's midsize offerings. Handling was soft and vague, with a suspension that floated like it had somewhere better to be. In short, the Rebel could be fast in a straight line, but it always felt disconnected from the driver. By 1970, basic safety features were becoming standard, but the Rebel didn't innovate. No crumple zones, no airbags, and minimal structural reinforcements. AMC's build quality was inconsistent. Panel gaps were often uneven, and trim pieces had a reputation for loosening over time. Rust resistance was mediocre, and these cars didn't age gracefully unless meticulously maintained. The 1970 Rebel was AMC's final effort to keep the midsize line alive before it was replaced by the Matador in 1971. It sold modestly, neither a flop nor a hit. It didn't stand out in a highly competitive market, and its design didn't help. Enthusiasts ignored it. Collectors mostly overlook it today, unless it's the high-performance Rebel Machine. Most Rebels ended their days in scrapyards or as cheap beaters, quietly disappearing from the roads like a forgettable supporting actor in a B-movie. The 1970 AMC Rebel is a car that tried to play it safe, and as a result, it ended up being neither here nor there. It didn't have the charm or flair of its competitors, nor the boldness to truly stand out. It was functional, sure. It was affordable, yes. But in terms of design, the Rebel looked like it was as surprised as anyone to have made it off the assembly line. With its startled face, lumpy sides, and lack of identity, it faded into history. Not with a bang, but with a shrug. Number 4, the 1989 Ford Taurus SHO, a car that's become something of a cult classic for its performance, but one that also stands as a perfect case study in how bold design trends can age poorly. While the SHO super high output version of the Taurus impressed under the hood with its Yamaha-built V6 and manual gearbox, its styling, particularly from a modern design perspective, looked more like melted plastic than forward-thinking innovation. In this lecture, we'll separate the mechanical brilliance from the visual missteps and discuss how the original Taurus design helped Ford in the short term but left long-term stylistic baggage. By the mid-1980s, Ford was in trouble. Its lineup looked outdated, sales were sagging, and the Japanese automakers were gaining serious ground. Enter the 1986 Taurus, which broke from the traditional boxy American sedan mold with a radical aerodynamic design that shocked critics and buyers alike. By 1989, Ford decided to throw performance enthusiasts a bone with the SHO model, which aimed to combine European sport sedan dynamics with American pricing. Mechanically, it was a quiet revolution. Aesthetically, let's just say time hasn't been kind. The Taurus debuted with what was then considered a revolutionary design, but the SHO variant in 1989 didn't do much to elevate it beyond the base model's already polarizing appearance. The Taurus eschewed sharp lines and creases for a slippery, rounded silhouette. While this approach was novel in the mid-80s, by 1989 it was starting to feel like an aerodynamic overcorrection. The entire body looked soft, saggy, and indistinct. Critics described it as melting or amorphous, like a bar of soap left in the sun. One of the car's more criticized features was the narrow, squinting headlights, which made the front end look tired or uninterested. The SHO didn't have a traditional grille, just a thin intake slit and a body color panel with minimal adornment. At a glance, the front looked like a stunned amphibian. While Ford claimed this helped aerodynamics, in hindsight, it gave the Taurus a soulless, plasticky appearance. The SHO was supposed to be special, but visually it was nearly indistinguishable from a regular Taurus. Slightly different bumpers, subtle badging, and some aluminum wheels were all you got. It was a sleeper, yes, but also a missed opportunity to visually celebrate the performance under the hood. The Taurus SHO had a function-first cabin, but it shared most of its interior elements with the regular Taurus. The dashboard had a curved, one-piece design meant to look high-tech and ergonomic, but it mostly just looked blob-like and uninspired. Gauges were basic and didn't reflect the SHO's sportiness. Seats were supportive and functional, but Ford used hard plastics and generic trim, so the cabin felt more rental-grade than sports sedan. In short, plenty of function, but no visual flair. Here's where the SHO truly redeemed itself. The 1989 SHO came with a 3.0-liter DOHC 5.6, co-developed with Yamaha, producing 220 horsepower, an impressive figure for a front-wheel drive family sedan in the late 80s. It came standard with a 5-speed manual transmission, a rarity for anything American and four-door. Acceleration was brisk, the engine revved to 7,000 RPM, and it had a European-style performance character that blew away expectations. Unfortunately, it all lived under a body that looked more like an overinflated minivan than a performance machine. While the Taurus SHO has its loyal fans and a respected performance legacy, its styling hasn't aged well. The soft, round lines quickly fell out of favor by the early 1990s, replaced by sharper, more angular designs. The lack of visual distinction between the SHO and base Taurus models hurt its appeal over time, especially in the collector market. Many now view the original Taurus design as a relic of a weird design experiment, like the automotive equivalent of a lava lamp. Novel, but stuck in its decade. The 1989 Ford Taurus SHO is a perfect example of a car with brains and brawn hidden behind a bland, melted mask. Mechanically, it was a revelation, offering performance and engineering that rivaled far more expensive imports. But visually, it represented a design language that didn't evolve well, with squinty eyes, melted panels, and indistinct lines that made it look more like a household appliance than a sporty sedan. In the end, the Taurus SHO succeeded despite its appearance, not because of it, a rare case where the substance was strong enough to survive the stylistic shortcomings. Number 3, the 1961 Ramler American, a compact car that looked more like a rushed engineering experiment than a finished showroom product. With its upright proportions, narrow track, and design straight from the parts bin, the 61 American managed to be both a sales success and a design misfire. It was a car meant to be cheap, simple, and efficient, but its styling said something very different. We didn't have time to finish this properly. Let's explore how this oddball creation came to life, why it looked the way it did, and what legacy, if any, it left behind. By 1961, American Motors Corporation, AMC, was desperately trying to carve out a niche in a market dominated by the Big Three. Its president, George Romney, yes, the father of Mitt Romney, believed in sensible transportation, compact, fuel-efficient, no-frills cars aimed at frugal buyers. To save money, AMC reused as much old tooling and engineering as possible. The 1961 Ramler American was a resurrected version of the 1950 Nash Rambler, heavily revised but unmistakably rooted in the past. So what you got in 1961 was a car that wasn't new, but was reheated, reshaped, and, stylistically, a little confused. The 1961 Ramler American had a tall roof, narrow track, and short overall length. Visually, it looked like it had been stretched vertically, a design trait more common in European cars of the 1930s. The wheels sat awkwardly under the fenders with little overhang or visual balance, making the car resemble a child's sketch of a sedan. Its high beltline and small side windows gave it a claustrophobic, upright appearance, like someone had taken an old car body and simply squashed it inward from both sides. The front fascia of the 61 American had generic round headlamps, a simple mesh grille, and very little chrome or ornamentation. It looked as though the front end had been assembled from leftover parts, which, in some cases, it actually was. The result was a face that lacked character, presence, or anything resembling a design language. It wasn't charmingly retro, just awkwardly anonymous. The tail section featured simple slab sides, basic tail lights, and little effort at sculpting or elegance. Again, this was likely due to budget constraints, but it gave the car the visual flair of a utility box. In short, the car didn't look finished. It looked like a working prototype that accidentally made it into production. The interior was Spartan. Painted metal dashboards, thin vinyl seats, and basic controls. Headroom was generous thanks to the tall roof, but shoulder room and leg room were tight, making the car feel even more vertically stretched inside than out. The materials felt cheap, even by economy car standards. Hard plastics and exposed screws were common sights. It was utilitarian, and not in the cool, minimalist way. More like a government surplus filing cabinet with wheels. Power came from a flathead inline-six engine, a design that was already antiquated by 1961. Output was modest, around 90 horsepower, and acceleration was sluggish, especially when paired with the optional automatic transmission. Handling was compromised by its narrow track and high center of gravity, making it feel tippy and underdamped in corners. Fuel economy was decent, but that was about the only thing it had going for it under the hood. Despite all this, the 1961 Ramler American was actually one of the top-selling compact cars of its time. It was cheap, one of the most affordable new cars in the US. It was reliable, mechanically simple, and easy to repair. It appealed to budget-conscious Americans who didn't care what a car looked like, so long as it ran. This was a car for the utility-minded buyer. Think of it as the automotive equivalent of government-issued furniture. Ugly, durable, and never designed to spark joy. Today, the 1961 Ramler American is a curiosity, even among classic car enthusiasts. Few collect them, and they rarely show up at auctions or museums unless as a novelty. However, it played an important role in AMC's survival strategy, proving that you could repurpose old tooling, spend next to nothing on styling, and still put out a viable car for a niche market. But visually, it remains one of the least cohesive American car designs of the 1960s. Tall, narrow, and weirdly expressionless. It didn't look like it belonged in a dealership. It looked like it belonged on a loading dock. The 1961 Ramler American wasn't ugly in a flamboyant way. It was ugly in a way that made you wonder if anyone had even bothered to finish drawing it before they started stamping the panels. Its tall, narrow stance and parts bin styling gave it the visual charm of a piece of leftover industrial equipment. Still, it served a purpose. It helped AMC stay afloat, and it delivered basic transportation to a public that sometimes just needed to get from A to B, no matter how awkward they looked doing it. Number 2, the 1976 Chevrolet Chevet. Designed during a time of gas shortages, economic unease, and rising competition from Japan, the Chevet was General Motors' reluctant answer to a problem it never really wanted to solve. With tiny wheels, frail proportions, and a front fascia that looked like it had just lost its job, the 1976 Chevet didn't just look cheap. It embodied automotive resignation. It was the car that didn't roar into the market. It whimpered, "This is the best we could do." Let's take a detailed look at this underwhelming entry into the subcompact wars, its design, its engineering compromises, and why it became an accidental icon of defeatist car making. By the mid-1970s, GM was under pressure. The 1973 oil crisis had left Americans rethinking their love affair with big V8s and luxury barges. Meanwhile, Toyota, Datsun, Nissan, and Honda were gaining traction in the US by offering well-built, efficient small cars that didn't feel like punishment. GM needed a quick fix, something to rival the Civic or Corolla, but without investing in an entirely new domestic platform. The result? They looked to Brazil. That's right. The Chevet was based on GM's global T-Car platform, originally developed by Opel and used in South America. It was not designed for American roads or expectations, but it was cheap, light, and already built elsewhere. GM simply imported the blueprint, Americanized it slightly, and rushed it to market, and thus the Chevet was born. The Chevet's front end featured droopy round headlights, a sad plastic grille, and a stubby nose. It looked like it was frowning, as if it knew it wasn't good enough, but showed up anyway. The proportions were off. The front overhang was minimal, but not in a sleek way, more in a we forgot to finish it kind of way. The Chevet rode on 12-inch wheels, laughably small even by 1970s standards. This gave it a toy-like stance that did nothing for stability or style. The narrow track and tall glass house made it feel like the automotive equivalent of a folding chair. Functional but fragile. There were no styling flourishes, no sculpted fenders, no chrome trim worth mentioning. It had the visual presence of a budget appliance. And yet, in some ways, that was the point. GM wanted it to look economical, as if to say, yes, you're making sacrifices, and you'll see them every time you get in. The dashboard was a block of plastic, with gaps so wide you could see daylight in some trim levels. Seats were thinly padded and offered all the support of a beanbag chair. The vinyl cracked quickly, and the cloth options were no better. Controls were minimalist to the point of being crude. Pull knobs, stiff levers, and cheap switchgear that felt like they came from a toy manufacturer. There was no attempt at comfort, only compliance with the bare minimum of what counted as a car in America. The 1976 Chevet launched with a 1.4-liter inline-4 engine, producing a wheezy 53 horsepower. A larger 1.6-liter engine with 60 horsepower was optional, but didn't help much. Acceleration was glacial. 0 to 60 mph times hovered around 18 seconds, depending on conditions. Even with a 4-speed manual transmission, the Chevet felt like it was always in the wrong gear, either screaming too loud or lugging too slow. Fuel economy was decent, but Japanese competitors delivered better performance, better refinement, and equal or superior mileage. The Chevet was understeered to oblivion. Its steering was vague, its suspension soft, and its braking barely adequate. On highways, crosswinds were a serious concern. At high speeds, which it struggled to reach, the Chevet felt like it was being blown off course by strong thoughts, let alone actual gusts. In corners, it leaned like a bar stool and squealed like it was in pain. It wasn't dangerous exactly, just flimsy and overwhelmed by almost any driving condition outside of flat city streets. Despite all its flaws, the Chevet was a commercial success for GM. Why? It was one of the cheapest cars on the market, often advertised under $3,000. It was simple and easy to fix, especially for budget-conscious drivers. It filled the void left by the Vega and gave GM something, anything, to put on the lot when customers came asking for fuel-efficient transport. In short, the Chevet succeeded not because people wanted it, but because they couldn't afford to want anything else. Today, the 1976 Chevrolet Chevet is remembered in much the same way as beige wallpaper or municipal carpeting. Functional, forgettable, and the result of cost-cutting decisions. Design-wise, it has no redeeming elegance. It was not charmingly ugly, just plain, awkward, and insecure in every detail. Like a substitute teacher in a raincoat, it didn't command respect, only quiet tolerance. Number 1, the 1971 Ford Pinto, a car that has become infamous for more than just its engineering flaws. But while its reputation as a fire hazard on wheels often dominates the conversation, we're going to take a different route today. We're going to talk about its styling, or perhaps more accurately, its styling missteps. With its stubby silhouette, awkward proportions, and concave rear end that looked like it was sucking in its own tail, the Pinto was a car that managed to look both apologetic and unsure of its own purpose. It was Ford's attempt to build a small, affordable, American compact for the post-muscle car era, but the results were far from elegant. Let's explore how the Pinto's exterior design, packaging compromises, and misguided visual cues made it look like a squashed jelly bean with no flavor. The Pinto was conceived in a hurry, under pressure from the rising success of small imports like the Toyota Corolla, Datsun 510, and Volkswagen Beetle. Ford President Lee Iacocca demanded a subcompact that could be designed and ready for production in just 25 months. That's an incredibly short time to engineer an entirely new platform, and design took a back seat to cost-cutting, speed, and simplicity. The resulting car was not only mechanically vulnerable, but visually stunted as well. The Pinto debuted in 1971, and its visual message was clear. This is not your dad's Mustang. This is the cheapest thing Ford could glue together with a hatchback. The Pinto's front fascia was plain and pinched, featuring tiny sealed beam headlights flanking a narrow grille that looked like an afterthought. The hood sloped downward as if the car were ashamed of its own presence, giving it a timid, shrinking appearance. Its short front overhang emphasized the Pinto's tight packaging, but made it look almost cartoonish from a side view. It was a face that looked more like it belonged on a child's toy than a real car. Nothing said confidence. Everything said economy box with no ambition. From the side, the Pinto was awkwardly compact, with a short wheelbase and tallish roofline that gave it a top-heavy appearance. The door-to-quarter panel proportions were cramped, and the windows seemed too tall relative to the body. On the coupe version, the roofline ended in a sharp drop-off, leading into the car's strangest visual feature, its rear. The car lacked the stretched elegance of European subcompacts and the cohesion of Japanese rivals. The Pinto looked like two-thirds of a real car, chopped off at both ends and filled in with budget plastic. Ah yes, the back of the Pinto, possibly its most visually confusing aspect. Rather than giving the rear a smooth taper or clean tail, Ford designers opted for a concave panel that sucked inward toward the license plate area. Combined with thin vertical taillights and a high rear bumper, this made the car look like it had rear-ended itself. It created the illusion of the Pinto being compressed from behind, like someone had parked too close to a wall and just kept going. The result was a rear end that looked like a jelly bean trying to fold in on itself, all while mounted on tiny 13-inch wheels that only enhanced the roller skate aesthetic. Those wheels were a huge part of the Pinto's visual problem. Too small, too skinny, and paired with wide wheel arches, they gave the Pinto the stance of a shopping cart. The lack of visual weight at the bottom of the car made it seem ungrounded. A tall, narrow body floating on four coasters. It didn't help that the Pinto came with hubcaps the size of saucers, or that its suspension was high enough to accommodate potholes but not cornering. Inside, the Pinto continued the visual austerity with minimalist dashboards, flat door panels, and a sea of hard plastics. The worst part? Ford offered some truly eyeball-searing color combinations in the name of 70s fashion. Avocado green with tan vinyl, anyone? It all added up to an interior that felt cheaper than it looked, which is saying something. Ford marketed the Pinto as the little carefree car, a zippy, fun urban runabout. The problem was, it didn't look like it wanted to have fun. It looked nervous, not confident, bland, not bold, and despite being relatively light and agile, its form didn't communicate any of that. While competitors like the VW Beetle had quirky charm and the Honda Civic had tidy proportions, the Pinto had visual self-doubt. Today, the Pinto is remembered primarily for its exploding fuel tanks, but its visual design deserves its own corner in the Museum of Regrettable Aesthetics. It looked like a compromise. It drove like a compromise. And it was styled with all the excitement of a tax form. The Pinto's squashed, stubby, and awkwardly concave body might not have killed people like the fuel tank did, but it definitely murdered any sense of pride its owners might have had.